Today I'm gonna play a chess game against a Russian chess player. His name is Foxtrot 2.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
His ranking in chess.com is 1851.
Oh my god!
So, my first move as white is I move my pawn to e4. His response is moving his pawn to e5. I move my knight to f3. His response is moving his knight to c6. Very basic. Now, I moved my bishop to b5, and he moved his pawn to d6. I castled, and he moved his knight to f6. I moved my pawn to d4, offering a pawn-to-pawn exchange, but he did not accept it. Then he moved his bishop to d7. I responded moving my pawn to d5, threatening the knight, and the knight retreats, offering a bishop to bishop exchange. So I took the bishop using my bishop on d7. Now queen takes bishop on d7. I move my rook to e1. Opponent's knight moved his opponent moved his knight to g6. I move my pawn to c4. My opponent moved his pawn to d6. I move my pawn to b3. I move my opponent moved his bishop to e7. I move my knight to c3. My opponent moved his pawn to a6. I move my queen to e2, and my opponent castled. I move my queen to d3, and my opponent moved his queen to g4. I threatened the knight using my pawn on h3. My opponent threatened my queen using his knight on f4. Now I took his knight using my bishop on f4. Queen takes my bishop on f4. I move my pawn to e3. Black moves his knight on h5. White moves pawn to g4, threatening the knight, and knight moves away. Then again, I move my pawn to g5, and knight again moves away. My next move is to threaten the queen using my knight on e2, and my opponent moved his knight, threatening also my queen on c5. Threatening my queen, moving his knight on c5. So now, my knight takes his queen on f4, and my opponent moved his knight to d3, taking my queen. Now, he made the wrong move because, of course, what happened in here is that I'm gonna take his knight with my knight. Okay, so if we will count the pieces, still have two knights, two rooks, but my opponent have only one bishop and two rooks, and his bishop is a bad bishop. You know why? Because most of the pieces are in green. If his bishop is a white bishop, it's a good bishop because he can move free. Because that bishop can move freely. Okay. So next, my opponent moved his pawn to f5. I move my king to g2. My opponent took the pawn on e4. I took the pawn on e4 using my rook. Now, black moves to f5 using on his rook, and then I move my pawn to h4. Rook moves to f8, threatening my knight. I move my knight to d4. Rook moves away, goes to f7. I move my knight to e6, threatening the rook, and then the rook goes to c8. And again, I move my knight to b4. My opponent moves his pawn to a5. I move my knight to c6, threatening the bishop. Bishop moves away. Bishop goes to f8. Now, I move my pawn to f4. My opponent moves his pawn to g6. I took the pawn on e5. My opponent moved his pawn to h6. I moved my pawn to h5, offering also a pawn-to-pawn exchange. Now, my opponent took the pawn on g5. I took the pawn on g6.
何？お前はもう死んでいる。
My opponent moved his rook to f6, and that's a wrong move because I took the rook on f6 using my pawn. My opponent didn't see that. Okay? Very lucky. And now, this one is very dangerous on his part because he will be checkmated via pawn. There's no escape. Okay? My opponent resigns on this take. Okay, that's all. Me win. I win on this match. Thank you very much. That's all.